We're joined today by Herbert Smith Freehill's partner Jason Betts to discuss the latest developments in Australian class action litigation. Jason, can you tell us about the recent Allco decision and its implications for class actions in Australia?
The Allco decision was a very big milestone in the litigation funding environment in Australia. Funders generally have two problems when they start a class action. One is that they'll only act for people who enter into a funding agreement with them, and the other is it takes time to find those people and book build them. Allco was a decision about getting a common fund order, which meant that at the start of the case, the funder's guaranteed to have that relationship with everyone, irrespective of whether they sign funding agreements or not. Why is that important? That means the life of the funder's easier. Bigger class actions, easier to start, larger quantum, greater exposure. And so that order was what they were seeking, but the court refused it, really on the grounds that the court wasn't going to facilitate something that made the funder's life better if it didn't actually facilitate access to justice. And that was why the decision was a big watch point for the entire legal profession.
Looking ahead, what does the future hold for class actions in Australia?
Well, we need to remember that we've got the most sophisticated funding environment in the world, and after the United States we've certainly got the most prolific class action environment. So notwithstanding what happened in Allco, we have a very sophisticated and developed market. Shareholder class actions will continue to drive growth, but we've seen funders and others that promote class actions expand into the consumer contract area, large number of customers with client interfacing arrangements, and more recently firms have been targeting environmental toxic exposure, which is a US characteristic that we haven't seen in our class action environment but may be emerging. So continued growth, not at the US levels, but certainly at a level which you would regard as a mainstay of litigation risk in Australia.
What advice would you give to company directors and boards in regards to the risk of class actions?
Probably three pieces of advice. The first is to recognise and acknowledge that class action risk is inevitable. It's not unlucky to be faced with a class action, it's part of doing business now in Australia. The second is communications. Once the risk arises, that 2 to 4 week period is the time when damaging communications are generated. So having a protocol for dealing with the risk that involves your legal advisors and that's controlled and centralised there's almost nothing more important, because when the case emerges, it's those documents that are going to be the ones that judge the company. And lastly, class action litigation is very different to conventional litigation. It's chalk and cheese from a conventional unilateral proceeding. Here, you've got the risk of making a mistake multiplied across hundreds of thousands of people potentially. It requires specialist advice at an early stage. It's not something that you can afford to approach in the conventional way.
Jason, thank you for joining us.
No problem, thanks.